Welcome to our deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about, well, we're not actually prepping for battle or anything, but we're going to be taking some insights from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War.
Ah, interesting.
So we're going to be looking at military and political conflicts throughout history and even some ancient fables and seeing how we can apply, maybe some of the wisdom or some of the insights to our own everyday lives.
Right. I think people, when they think about war, they think about something very, very different.
Yeah.
It's really about the dynamics of conflict.
Exactly.
And how to achieve goals through strategic thinking, whether it's on a battlefield or in our daily interactions.
Right. And so Greene kicks this off by talking about the importance of enemies. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why don't you explain that further?
Well, I think humans, we tend to define ourselves in opposition to others.
Mm-hmm.
So having a clearly defined enemy, even if it's not, a literal person,
right,
can help you focus your energy.
Yeah.
Can help you define your goals.
Right.
Think of it like a sculptor, chipping away at a block of marble to reveal a masterpiece.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So the enemy in this case is everything that isn't the masterpiece. Right.
Huh?
And removing that brings you closer to your vision.
That's an interesting analogy.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. So
Yeah.
he uses Margaret Thatcher's political campaign as an example of that.
Right.
I remember reading about how she really kind of positioned socialism as her enemy to really energize her base and get them, going.
Yeah. And it's not about hostility, but it's about creating a sense of purpose, rallying people around a shared goal.
Mm-hmm.
Who are your enemies, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
It could be those bad habits that you're trying to break. It could be, the negative self-talk that's holding you back.
Right. That's a great question to ponder, isn't it? Because just identifying those things can really help us clarify what we're striving for. So now he also cautions against fighting the last war.
Yeah.
He uses that fable of the bat and the weasels, which is such a clever story.
It is.
Can you remind us how that goes?
Well, the bat gets caught by a weasel who hates birds.
Okay.
Right? So to save itself, the bat convinces the weasel it's a mouse.
Uh-huh.
Right? Later, a weasel who hates mice catches the bat.
Oh.
And this time it escapes by claiming to be a bird.
Oh, so adaptable.
Right.
Wow.
So what does that teach us?
But how does that apply to, to us?
Yeah.
I mean, beyond just being flexible.
Well, I think it teaches us that clinging to old strategies can be our downfall.
Right.
We might be very successful using a certain approach, but the world changes.
Right.
Just think about how the internet has disrupted so many industries.
Yeah.
So sticking to outdated methods is like using dial-up in the age of broadband.
Yeah.
It simply won't get you where you need to go.
I think a lot of us are probably guilty of fighting the last war in our personal lives too.
Sure.
Just clinging to habits or thought patterns that might have served us once, but
It's so easy to fall into that trap.
aren't really helpful anymore. So the key is to be like Napoleon, who famously said he followed no fixed principles of war.
Exactly.
So he was constantly adapting his strategies based on the situation. So that's a powerful reminder to stay agile.
Yeah.
Speaking of, facing challenges, the book also emphasizes the importance of presence of mind, especially when it comes to dealing with fear. And, Greene argues that fear is the biggest obstacle to clear thinking, but we can't always avoid it, can we?
Absolutely. And instead of trying to avoid fear, he suggests we confront it head on.
Okay.
And he tells this great story about General Patton, who, despite being, this fearless leader, he experienced a moment of paralyzing fear during World War I. And he overcame it by envisioning his ancestors urging him forward. But I think what's interesting to me about that story is he didn't deny his fear.
Right.
He didn't suppress his fear. He acknowledged it.
Right.
And he used it to fuel his courage.
I think that's an important distinction, right?
Yeah.
It's not about becoming fearless.
No.
It's about acting in spite of fear.
Right.
That's a good, a good distinction. And so what fears are holding you back? And how can you confront them head on?
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful question that he poses.
It is.
Sometimes we think we need a safety net to really feel brave enough to pursue our goals, but Greene actually challenges that with his burning the boats strategy.
Yeah, I love this one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so dramatic.
He uses the example of Hernan Cortez literally burning his ships when he arrived in Mexico to conquer it.
I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that really
Talk about commitment.
showed commitment, right? But was that really necessary?
Well, Cortez knew that his men would be more likely to fight fiercely if they knew there was no way to retreat.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Burning the ships eliminated that option.
Right.
It forced them to fully commit to their mission.
So it wasn't really about recklessness. It was about creating...
Right. It was about creating a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose.
Urgency and purpose, yeah. And I think the principle of burning the boats can be applied to so many areas of our lives, especially those goals we keep putting off.
Oh, yeah.
It's really about identifying those comfort zones that are actually holding us back.
Yeah.
And so think about it. Are you clinging to a job you hate because it feels safe? Or are you afraid to start that creative project you've been dreaming about because you're worried about failing? I mean, in those situations, identifying and burning those metaphorical boats can be the catalyst.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. I think that's brilliant.
For real change, yeah. Now, this next strategy, creating a powerful cause, really gets into the psychology of motivation, doesn't it? And throughout history, effective leaders have understood that people are most motivated when they feel like they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. And it's not just about personal gain.
No.
It needs to be a cause that feels progressive, future-oriented. Almost like a moral crusade, wouldn't you say?
I'd say so.
Yeah, and he compares the motivational techniques of Oliver Cromwell and Hannibal Barca. And, one led a revolution, the other a daring military campaign. But both of them, despite vastly different contexts, managed to really rally their troops by giving them a cause worth fighting for.
And dying for.
Yeah. So how do we apply that in our own lives? It's not like we're leading armies into battle, right?
Right. But we can still find ways to connect our goals to a larger purpose. So, think about the impact your work has on others, or how your efforts contribute to a cause you believe in. I think when you frame your actions in this way, it can be incredibly motivating.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's about finding that sense of meaning and purpose that fuels our efforts.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is amazing how that sense of purpose can just fuel like everything, right? So moving on, Greene delves into, strategies for understanding and kind of controlling the dynamics of conflict.
Okay.
And one of the key strategies he highlights is knowing your enemy.
Right. And that seems so crucial in war, but how does that apply to our, everyday conflicts?
Well, imagine going into a negotiation without understanding the other person's motivations or goals.
Right.
You might be focused on winning at all costs, but if you don't know what the other side truly values, you could end up with a deal that doesn't benefit anyone.
Right. So it's about seeing the situation from that perspective.
Exactly, yeah. And Greene, he uses the British invasion of Afghanistan in 1839 as a kind of a cautionary tale here. The British just completely underestimated the Afghans' fierce determination to defend their homeland.
Right.
And it led to a disastrous outcome.
Wow.
They just failed to see the world through their enemy's eyes, and it cost them dearly.
Yeah, it's a reminder that our assumptions about others can often be our biggest blind spots.
Yeah.
We tend to project our own thoughts and feelings onto them.
We do, yeah.
And that can lead to so many misunderstandings and conflicts.
Absolutely. And this principle extends far beyond, military campaigns.
Right.
Think about your workplace, for instance. Let's say you have a colleague who constantly interrupts you during meetings.
Right.
Instead of assuming they're just being rude or disrespectful, what if you tried to understand their motivations?
Yeah.
Maybe they're feeling insecure about their own ideas.
Yeah.
They're trying to, overcompensate. Or perhaps they haven't learned the art of, respectful communication.
Yeah.
Right. So by seeking to understand their perspective,
Right.
you can find, I think, more effective ways to address the situation.
Right.
Maybe it's a gentle conversation about, meeting etiquette.
Yeah.
Or perhaps it's about creating a space where they feel more comfortable sharing their ideas.
So knowing your enemy isn't about demonizing the other person.
Yeah, not at all.
But about, understanding their perspective and finding common ground.
Absolutely.
I like that.
Now, Greene also emphasizes the power of surprise as a way to gain an advantage in conflict. And he uses the example of the German Blitzkrieg in World War II, which was so effective because it was so unexpected and swift.
Right, yeah. I mean, the Germans used a combination of speed and mobility and concentrated firepower to overwhelm their opponents before they could even react.
Exactly. It's like a chess player making a move that completely disrupts their opponent's carefully planned strategy.
Yeah, so how can we apply the principle of surprise in, our everyday lives? It's not like we're going to launch a military attack on our coworkers, right?
Yeah, of course not. But think about it this way. What if, instead of reacting defensively when someone criticizes you, you respond with, unexpected kindness and understanding?
Right.
Or imagine you're in a creative rut at work and you surprise your team with a completely out-of-the-box idea, right? It's about shaking things up, breaking those predictable patterns, and gaining a fresh perspective.
Those are some great examples. Yeah, it's about shaking things up. It's about, kind of breaking those predictable patterns and gaining a fresh perspective.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now let's shift our focus a little bit to the concept of power dynamics, which Greene argues are present in all relationships. Yeah, I think I'll kind of instinctively understand this.
Right.
But he points out that most of us aren't consciously aware of how these dynamics are constantly at play in our interactions. And that can put us at a disadvantage. He uses the example of Mae West, the iconic Hollywood actress who was a master at controlling the power dynamic in her favor.
Right.
She knew her worth and wasn't afraid to walk away from projects if her demands for creative control weren't met.
Yeah, she famously negotiated with Paramount Pictures to get more creative control over her movies.
Didn't she?
Yeah, and her boldness paid off. She understood that true power lies not in, domineering others, but in strategically setting the terms of engagement.
Right. That's a powerful insight.
It is.
It's not about being manipulative, but it's about recognizing our own worth and setting healthy boundaries in our relationships.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Now, this next strategy might hit a little close to home for some of us.
Yep.
Passive aggression as a weapon.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, boy.
I think we've all been on the receiving end of that.
We all have.
At some point, haven't we?
Absolutely.
It's so infuriating because it's so indirect.
It is, yeah.
And difficult to confront.
It is.
It's a strategy that operates in the shadows, right? Aiming to disarm and demoralize the opponent through these subtle tactics.
Right, and so Greene used the example of Frederick Douglass refusing to be beaten by his slave master.
Yeah. Great example.
So can you elaborate on that?
Douglass knew that physically fighting back would be futile, right? So he chose a different form of resistance.
Okay.
He refused to give his master the satisfaction of seeing him broken.
Right.
And by maintaining his dignity and refusing to be cowed, he shifted the power dynamic in a subtle but really profound way.
Yeah, that's such a powerful example of how sometimes the most effective response is no response at all.
Right. Or a response that doesn't engage with the aggression directly.
Right. And so think about a time when you might have been the target of passive aggression.
Yeah.
Did you get sucked into the drama? Or were you able to, step back, maintain your composure, and redirect the energy?
Great question to reflect on.
Yeah, sometimes disengaging is the most strategic move.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is sometimes, right? Just walking away can be so much more powerful than actually engaging in it. So now, in the final section of the 33 Strategies of War, Greene unveils what he calls advanced strategies for indirect warfare. And these are the tactics that really emphasize, the psychological dimensions of conflict, right?
Absolutely. And they're surprisingly relevant to our everyday lives.
Yeah. So one strategy that stood out to me was the counterattack. And it's about using your opponent's aggression against them. So it's not about striking first.
No.
But it's about strategically waiting for the right moment to respond, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And Greene explains that letting your enemy make the first move offers several advantages.
Okay.
It allows you to observe their tactics, identify their weaknesses, and even more importantly, expose them as the aggressor in the eyes of others.
Right. He uses the example of Teddy Roosevelt, who was a master of this strategy in his political campaigns.
Yeah, Roosevelt would often let his opponents rant and rave, allowing them to paint themselves as, unreasonable and hot-headed.
Right.
And then he would calmly and eloquently dismantle their arguments, making himself appear as the voice of reason.
Right. Almost like a judo move.
It is, exactly.
Right. You use your opponent's momentum against them.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it's a tactic we can use in our own lives.
Mm.
For example, let's say you're in a heated debate with someone.
Right.
And they're resorting to personal attacks.
Right.
Instead of getting defensive or firing back, what if you paused, took a deep breath, and calmly pointed out, the flaws in their logic?
Right. And that takes a lot of self-control.
It does.
But I can see how it would be incredibly effective in disarming the situation.
Yeah.
Right. It's about winning the argument without stooping to their level.
Absolutely. It's about rising above the fray.
Yeah. And another strategy that really resonated with me was turning weakness into strength. And Greene argues that everyone has limitations, but it's really how we perceive and leverage those limitations that makes all the difference.
Absolutely.
He tells this fascinating story about the Ojibwe Wendigokin warriors.
Oh, yeah.
Who were known for their seemingly mad behavior. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So these warriors cultivated a reputation for unpredictability and ferocity.
Mm-hmm.
They would howl like wolves, wear animal masks.
Oh, wow.
And engage in rituals that terrified their enemies.
Right.
And while this might seem like a disadvantage,
yeah,
they used it to their advantage.
Yeah.
They created a psychological edge that helped them achieve victories against larger forces.
So it's about embracing what makes you different and using it to your advantage.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, think about your own perceived weaknesses.
Yeah.
Maybe you're shy or introverted. Could you reframe that as being a thoughtful listener who carefully considers all angles before speaking?
I love that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Now, let's talk about the art of maneuvering.
Okay.
And Greene reminds us that skilled strategists, they think in terms of campaigns, not just individual battles, right?
Right.
They're always looking several steps ahead, anticipating their opponent's moves and plotting their course accordingly. And he uses the example of General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea during the American Civil War, which was considered very unconventional.
It was.
I think
that Sherman's march was a bold move.
Yeah.
He bypassed heavily fortified Confederate positions and instead focused on disrupting their supply lines and demoralizing the civilian population.
Wow.
It was a risky strategy, but it ultimately proved to be a turning point in the war.
So it's about thinking strategically and finding creative ways to achieve your objectives, even if it means taking an indirect route.
Exactly. Sometimes you need to sacrifice a pawn to win the game.
Right, exactly. Now, this next strategy is a bit unsettling, but incredibly relevant to our current world. Sowing uncertainty and panic.
Yeah.
And this is where Greene really, delves into the darker side of conflict, exploring how fear and uncertainty can be used as weapons. And so he uses the historical example of the Shashin, a secretive group of assassins who terrorize their enemies through targeted killings and psychological warfare.
Yeah, they didn't need to conquer vast armies.
Right.
They achieved their objectives by creating a climate of fear and paranoia.
Right. And sadly, we see these tactics being used today, don't we?
We do.
I mean, think about how misinformation and propaganda are used to manipulate public opinion and sow discord.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that information warfare is a very real threat.
Right, and the constant barrage of negativity and sensationalism in the news, it can be overwhelming.
It can.
Right, it makes us feel anxious and powerless. So how do we combat this kind of psychological warfare?
Well, Greene argues that the best defense against fear and manipulation is rationality and courage. It's about cultivating critical thinking skills, seeking out diverse perspectives, and refusing to be swept up in the tide of fear-mongering.
That's a powerful message to end on.
It is.
Conflict is an inevitable part of life, but how we choose to navigate it makes all the difference.
Absolutely.
By understanding the psychology of conflict and using these strategies wisely, we can become more effective in our personal and professional lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you for this insightful deep dive into the 33 strategies of war. We hope you've gleaned some valuable insights that you can apply to your own life.
Absolutely.
Remember, the ultimate goal is not to conquer others, but to master ourselves and our approach to conflict.
I love that.
So what will your winning strategy be?